Hi guys, my name is Mariah Kidd, and today I'm going to be talking about my observations at Umstead State Park. So the first thing I'm going to discuss is how the site was chosen. So part of it was convenience. Umstead State Park is located less than 10 minutes away from my apartment, making it very convenient, easy to get to. The site itself was also located off of the trail, meaning there was less human interference, but not too far off from the trail that I could potentially get lost. I also chose this site because while walking to it, I immediately noticed that there were different plants at the location of the site than there were in other areas I saw while walking to it. So here's a brief map of my site. So I went down the inspirational trail in order to get to my location. And then I came across a bridge, and here's my creek. As you can see, I walked off the trail, and this location here was where I actually located my data, and I'll show how I chose that particular spot later on in the presentation. The arrows indicate a descending slope. So the creek was located at the end of the slope, so in here. So here are some of the plants that I observed. This is some of the moss, which I only saw growing very close, like around here in this drop-off area on the creek. And here are the rolled up ferns. And I saw this vine right here going up a lot of trees, so I'm assuming it's parasitic. One of the number one things I noticed at the site was that there was a lot of leaf litter, a very significant amount. And that the trees were pretty evenly dispersed, but I'll discuss more about the trees later on. And then you can kind of see that they're this very long developed leaf here, and these smaller ones is actually located right here. So as you can see, it's very close to this large body of flowing water. Well, the largest amount of flowing water at that site. So here's some of the questions that I came across while visiting my site. So the first one was, why are there only young trees at the creek? Meanwhile, the older ones are farther from it. Here, young trees were defined as being 6 inches in diameter or less. So as you can see, we have these smaller trees that are located very near the creek, which you can kind of see here, whereas larger ones are much farther away. So my hypothesis for this is that the creek used to have higher water levels, and so the trees could not establish there or else they'd get waterlogged. But as water levels descended, the new trees could then establish themselves. My next question was, does the leaf litter affect the growth of new plants? For instance, will the plant not be able to find enough light because of the thick layer of litter? However, while visiting my site, I did notice that there were a lot of smaller plants that were still sprouting. So based on this, I would hypothesize that the plants grown here would have to be fast growing in order to sprout very quickly, or just be really resilient to low levels of light. My third question was, will the soil remain saturated throughout the year? Will it dry out in the summer? Based on like the very low water levels that I observed, I would assume that it would dry out, which would then affect the plants that grow there. And the insects that we would see, yes, they would have to feed off of a different source. So my project was based on observations that I had at the site. So I decided to investigate how the moisture gradient created by the creek would affect the growth and occurrence of ferns. And I actually only saw ferns located near my site and was not seen far away from the creek at all. Also, when I talk later about my data, when I say a rolled leaf, this is what I'm going to mean here. An unrolled would be this fully expanded leaf. So my hypothesis was that as we move farther from the creek, there will be less ferns due to a decrease in soil moisture along the gradient, this being the soil moisture gradient. So here is my hypothesis of what the graph would look like. So number of ferns, I predict a really gradual decrease, so definitely not a stark slope. And then I also thought that ferns observed will become smaller as moving down the gradient. I predicted that there would be a starker slope here as the water would become a more limiting factor, and therefore the plant would not be able to get the resources it needs to be very large. So the methods I did was that I selected the area with the most flowing water, assuming that this would have the highest soil moisture levels. And then I laid down a measuring tape until I didn't see any ferns anymore. The ferns that were located within a foot on either side of the tape were observed and data was collected. And once again, I stopped where there were no ferns present, and this ended being about 8.24 meters from the original location. So here is the graph or my results. So the length of the longest leaf across the gradient, as you can see, there's a very stark decrease, but it eventually levels off minus this one outlier that did not have any fully expanded leaves. So I didn't take any measurements for it. This here is the number of unrolled leaves across the moisture gradient. And as you can see, there's a there's a noticeable decrease in the slope, which is what I predicted. These would be plants that were less developed. Yeah. And then the total number of leaves per fern across a moisture gradient. Once again, you see the stark decrease, but relatively levels off. And then the number of rolled leaves across the moisture gradient. So this one was really strange to me and really helped me interpret these results. So I want everyone to pay close attention to how there's first a decrease, and then we had a slight increase here, meaning that these plants contained more rolled leaves as we moved farther away compared to these that were in the middle. So my interpretation of the results was that based on the line graph, which was the first one we looked at, there's a sharp decline in the height of ferns until it began to level off at around 81.28 centimeters. Overall, based on the graphs, it seemed like the ferns located far away from the water were actually just farther behind developmentally, meaning that they had more rolled leaves instead of expanded ones. Whereas so they were smaller, but it was because they weren't fully grown yet. However, there were still no ferns after 823 centimeters. Therefore, there still seems to be an association with the higher moisture content and the occurrence of ferns itself. So my future directions with doing a larger study would have big picture questions like, as the climate changes and the creek potentially dries up, will the plant community change? Will ferns eventually die off from the state park? And how will this affect the ecosystem after an extended period of time? What plants will replace the ferns, and what new food sources will herbivores find? So general approaches to testing my hypothesis or my questions, I would look at multiple locations across the state park just to get more samples. And I would record the moisture gradient in a more formal way, just to have very specific numbers for that. There would also need to be multiple samples taken across growing seasons, so that way we can see how the growing seasons were affecting the growth of the ferns. And I also want to record the insects seen while working with the fern and monitor if they change as fern populations change, and observe the moisture levels over time and see how these change and if climate change is really making an effect there. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for watching.